Chapter 34 The Martyr and the Goose. Saint-Domingue, 1791. Returning to laundry and cooking was harder than Marie expected after the exhilarating chaos of the medical tent, even if she had been on the wrong side of the line. She had returned to La Guinaudet fraught with worry about Rose, but thankfully Julia had managed to leave a message about her daughter's whereabouts. Marie had to applaud Father Ceballos. She would have never thought to send Rose to hide in a Taino village. It brought her incredible comfort, but the miracle was short-lived. A few weeks later, Rose stumbled up the dirt road, a ghost of herself, her eyes ringed with exhaustion and her voice hoarse from screaming. The gendarmes were as merciless as wolves, tearing Luc from his wife's arms in the dead of night. For days, they barely heard fragments. The only person who was given access to his cell was Father Ceballos, and Marie feared he was softening the truth of Luc's condition to protect their sensitivities. She knew what the Grand Blanc did to those they feared. They were certainly trying to torture him into admitting he was complicit in Auger's rebellion, rather than teaching native children to conjugate verbs. And yet, the community rose up. In small, astonishing acts of resistance, neighbors and parents gave statements claiming the school's closure had been scheduled. Some even swore they had helped pack Luc and Rose's teaching supplies. It was a lie, but one they told with conviction. Then came Ceballos, who, it turned out, had a flair for drama Marie hadn't anticipated. She found herself wondering whether God frowned upon such well-meaning deception, or quietly sanctioned it. On the 6th day of Luc's incarceration, the priest delivered his magnum opus. Ceballos marched to the magistrate's courtyard with a dozen Taino children in tow. One by one, they knelt and recited prayers in careful, memorized French, invoking the saints and petitioning for their teacher's release. Their voices echoed off the stone in a performance that was hard for even the most aggrieved Grand Blanc to ignore. The pressure of the church was too much for the courts. Through a manipulated miracle, Luc was pried from the edge of the hangman's noose. His release was the picture of divine intervention, but it was also unimaginably tragic. The man who emerged from prison was so atrociously beaten, it was a wonder Luc had survived at all. He could not walk. His skin was covered in such deep bruises that they were visible through his melanin. From Marie best estimation, at least 6 ribs had been broken. His left eye was swollen to the point it could not open, and, despite the Caribbean heat, Luc shivered as if the air was arctic. But battered as he was, Luc was alive. That was a blessing of the highest order in times such as these. Many others were not so lucky to have holy protection, particularly Vincent Auger. There was never a chance at sparing the life of Saint-Domingue's revolutionary leader. He had run into the open mouth of danger far too publicly for mercy. His face had been plastered across the colony, on church doors, plantation gates, storefronts, and tavern walls. Marie had seen the posters herself. Everyone had. She had studied his image. They had sketched him with deliberate menace. But even through the exaggeration, something truthful shone through. He was a fine, tall, slim young fellow, with black eyes and hair as dark as the raven's wing. And his whole appearance bespoke that calmness and resolution peculiar to men accustomed from their cradle to contend with danger. This was the man who had ignited so much hope, and then caused so much pain. It was a pity. He would have made an incredible leader. But that was not to be his fate. The reward for his capture was enough to turn saints into spies, and in the end, it was the Spanish who betrayed him. They extradited him back to the French as a traitor, professing loudly that black indiscipline would not be tolerated on either side of the island. Word of his capture tore through the colony like a hurricane, splitting the island in half over ideological lines. The whites toasted with champagne. They held dances, banquets, and card games, clinking glasses to celebrate the end of his menace on the island. The black and mixed-race communities fell into deep mourning. In a single arrest, the French had managed to officially defeat Auger, squash the spirit of rebellion, and prevent the black vote. There was a trial, of course, but it was a sham. A carefully staged mockery meant to masquerade as justice. This made the trial all the more alluring to the island's social elite. To them, it wasn't a reckoning, it was theater. The Maubiers, ever eager to climb their social ladder, attended alongside their fashionable friends, treating the proceedings with the giddy anticipation of an opera premiere. Obviously, Marie Cosette hadn't been at the trial, but she had listened carefully at the Maubiers' dinner table, gleaning shreds of the truth from their cruel gossip. They mocked Auger's posture, his manner of speaking, even his clothes. But underneath the jeers, Marie Cosette was able to get a clearer picture of what had truly been occurring. Auger stood his ground. He had argued, clearly and without apology, that he was only demanding what the National Assembly had promised. Not revolution, not bloodshed, just the legal rights afforded to his people by the laws of the mother country. But no one in power had any interest in hearing facts. The courts laughed at the presumption that Paris could dictate terms to the colonies. Marie Cosette saw it plainly. On this island, the law bent not towards justice, but towards dominance. The only truths the Grand Blanc recognized were forged in violence and enforced through fear. The verdict was never in question. Auger's fate had been sealed long before the trial ever started. He would die at the merciless hands of the colonial government. His execution drew the largest crowd Marie Cosette had ever seen. It seemed all of Cap Français had turned out to watch. Julia had stayed behind to care for Luc, who was still fragile and feverish. Whatever sickness he had caught in prison clung to him pitilessly. Marie Cosette feared it had reached his lungs. He could barely sit up, much less walk. Still, when he heard the execution had been set, he had insisted Rose go in his place, even though she was hesitant to leave his side. They had to be there, to honor what they had lost. So, Rose stood beside Marie Cosette in the Maubiers' line that day. Her heart, like every black heart, weighted by fathomless grief. Militia swarmed the edges of the crowd, their muskets polished, their gazes sharp and suspicious. But for the planter class, it was a day of vainglorious triumph. Many, like the Maubiers, brought their enslaved laborers to witness the spectacle as a warning for anyone with rebellion in their heart. Some, like Henri Duclos, even dragged their laborers in actual chains to reinforce the point. Amidst the sea of faces, Marie Cosette's gaze caught on a face in Duclos' chain gang that made her heart stutter. She couldn't say why. The young man was unfamiliar, early 20s perhaps, his feet shackled and his eyes sunken. A breeze passed, bringing a moment of needed cool on the sweltering day. It brushed her cheek as if to draw her eyes towards him. The mystery man. She scanned the rest of the group for some clue as to his identity. She recognized another face. Dina. Luc's cousin. After all this time, she had not realized it was Henri Duclos that had severed that old man's leg 2 years before. Her stomach turned. She had waited on Henri and Élise Duclos at countless dinner parties, never suspecting until now it was their plantation which had wrought such cruelty. She looked for the old man in the line. He wasn't there. Perhaps he hadn't survived. Or maybe Duclos had found it too inconvenient to parade a maimed elder in chains when he had already shown the man personally how poorly he tolerated rebellion. Her eyes turned back to the mystery man. She didn't remember speaking to him while she was there. She must have known him from elsewhere, but it was eluding her. "Do you know that man?" she whispered to Jeanette. "Mama, there are literally thousands of people here. Which one?" Jeanette replied irritably. Marie-Cosette tried to point him out, to describe him, but Jeanette was no help whatsoever. Marie-Cosette tried to turn to Rose, but stopped before she said a word. The execution cart had appeared at the far end of the square. In the back was Vincent Auger, bruised and chained like an animal. Rotten fruit, refuse, and insults rained from the crowd as the cart tried to clear a path towards the gallows. Despite the hatred, Auger's voice rang out defiantly. "A man is held to be criminal sometimes by the great ones of the earth, not because he has committed a crime himself, but because he knows of one which has been committed." The crowd howled in outrage. "This vote is your right, my brothers. Do not stop fighting for it. We have been abandoned by those who still live in fear, but that is not cause to capitulate. Keep fighting, my brothers, keep—" A guard walking beside the cart struck him hard in the gut with the butt of his bayonet. Auger doubled over, breath knocked from his lungs. "Shut up," the guard growled. Finally, the cart lurched to a halt beside the gallows and Auger was escorted down. Father Ceballos, pale and tight-lipped, stood nearby to administer the last rites as Auger stared at the looming wheel atop the gallows. Executions were never pleasant to witness, but some methods were certainly worse than others, and the planters had sentenced Auger to one of the most excruciating. Marie-Cosette had never heard of breaking on the wheel until recently. But after the verdict was rendered, it was all anyone could whisper about. The more she learned, the more sickened she became. She understood why the Grand Blanc chose something so barbaric. It was the same reason they made sure all the black population bore witness to the execution. The whites didn't just seek to end Auger's life. They wanted the gruesome spectacle to deter others from dissent and rebellion. The wheel itself looked mostly harmless, as the executioner marched Auger to meet his grisly fate. He looked stoic, but also terrified. The crowd of thousands was mostly silent as Auger was hoisted up and tied to the wooden circle. A trickle of urine ran down the pant leg of the soon-to-be martyr. The silence was so potent that even in a crowd of thousands, many could hear the amber droplets hit the planks below his feet. Then Governor Durand climbed the scaffold and began to speak. He droned on for several minutes about consequences, law and order, and actually Marie-Cosette didn't really care to listen to whatever he was rambling about. Her attention was fixated on the faces of the people. Auger's terrified eyes, the Maubier's eager delight, the stone-cold fury of the mystery man in chains. She was staring at him again, when a loud shout and a ferocious crack quickly brought her attention back to Auger. The executioner held a large hammer. Auger's arm was visibly broken. Even from her distance, she could see the split. The helpless revolutionary's screams were likely heard for miles. The executioner did not stop. He moved with mechanical precision, breaking bone after bone. Auger howled until his voice gave out. Within the first few blows, several people in the square fainted. Marie-Sosette prayed a feverish Our Father. Each thunderous strike made her flinch. With every fracture, she felt something tear in her soul. The snaps of bone and sinew echoed in her ears from the relentless onslaught. Auger's body was mangled beyond recognition, yet the poor man would not die. Eventually, even the executioner himself seemed to be struggling with the brutality he had caused. His face was pale, sweat dripping from his brow. He eyed the governor forcefully, asking silent permission to kill the man, a coup de grace to end his suffering. But Durand was obstinate. Marie-Sosette wondered if the governor planned to leave him alive like Prometheus, to die slowly and be picked apart by ravenous birds until he finally succumbed from dehydration or starvation. The hammer fell again. There were no screams left for Auger to shed as blood poured down the wheel. His body was so butchered that the sight of it caused vomiting in the crowd. The governor's wife could not handle it anymore. She stood up and ran in front of her husband. "Retentum, please," she begged. Durand's jaw clenched. He clearly did not wish to end here, but his wife's pleas were going to render mercy unavoidable. Begrudgingly, he nodded to the executioner as he cradled his weeping wife. The executioner grabbed a rope and wrapped it around the revolutionary's neck until he had strangled the last breath from Vincent Auger. It was over. Marie-Sosette was glad. The poor man's suffering had finally ended. However, the governor was displeased at having to stop his torture early. He ordered Auger's head to be severed and piked in the marketplace. Furthermore, he ordered the wheel to remain where it was. If anyone tried to remove the mangled, headless corpse, he promised they would meet the same fate. Thus, Auger's remains were displayed to rot for however long the governor could stand the smell. The macabre specter haunted Marie-Sosette's mind. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw the decapitated head of the fallen rebel, his screams etched in her memory. It was all she could see as she watered the plants inside the parlor when Anna Maubier approached her later that day. "We just received a letter from the Comte de Breda. I don't suppose you know anything about that," Anna said snidely. Marie-Sosette gulped, then lifted her chin. "Yes, madame. I hired an attorney. What you are doing here is illegal. You are holding free people against their will and claiming my son's land as your own." "You insolent girl," Anna scoffed. "I never took you for a fool." "I am not a fool, Anna," she said. Marie-Sosette had never called Anna by her first name before, and it felt glorious. "I am a marquise." Anna's nose wrinkled disdainfully. "Your dead husband abandoned you the second you sniffed that title. You have never been, and never will be, nobility. You are a slave. You have no claim, and you have no rights." "I have read the laws," Marie-Sosette began. "The laws," Anna sneered. "The laws don't matter here, girl. You saw that clear as day this morning. You are nothing. Your case is nothing. Your little rebellion is less than nothing. Now, I am having guests for dinner to celebrate our victory. Why don't you go polish the silver?" "No," Marie Suzette said quietly. "I am not your slave." "But you are," Anna replied with mawkish cruelty. "You've been sold to my husband on 2 different occasions. The second time was not a sale. It was a kidnapping. I had already been freed, and you know that. My lawyer will prove it." Anna stepped closer. "You will die here, Marie Suzette. You will die a slave, because that is what you are. Now, I know that punishing you will not do anything. So if you do not fall in line in the next 30 seconds, I will inform the governor tonight at dinner that Jeanette was caught plotting to remove Auger's head from the pike. I will happily turn her over to the authorities as a sign of my loyalty to the crown and the governor." Marie Suzette froze. "That's right," Anna smiled maliciously. "So be a good slave and get this dining room ready. The governor is coming, and he has much to celebrate." There was a long silence as the 2 women stared at each other with the ferocity of lionesses. Marie Suzette was shaking in fury, but she curtsied obediently and staggered into the kitchen, her breath heaving. It couldn't end like this. These people, the Maubiers, the governor, their horrid friends. She was seething. Usually, in moments like this, she'd become despondent, make herself smaller. But not today. Something inside her snapped. She let out a guttural wail and hurled herself into a hanging rack of pots. The noise crashed through the kitchen. A kettle flew from her hand and clanged across the floor. She grabbed another, flung it against the stone wall. She didn't stop until the fire in her chest began to cool. At last, she stood still, panting. Her eyes burned, her hands trembled, but her resolve was steel. Nothing had changed. She still had a lawyer, a white lawyer. Why does a snake coil and hiss? Because it fears the heel that might crush it. Anna Maubier could hiss all she wanted. Marie Suzette was lacing her fiercest boots for the coming storm. But until then, she had a goose to cook. That night, at the Maubiers' party, conversation buzzed. The guests had mostly tried to avoid discussion of Auger's execution. The vivid memory of what had transpired that morning still lingered behind their eyes, threatening to spoil their appetite. Anna, refusing to have her perfect dinner party sullied by politics, tried to veer conversation towards the weather and church gossip. It worked for a while, but under the weight of recent events and too much wine, the discussion inevitably swerved towards the tumultuous events unfolding across the seas in France. Just as Marie Suzette began serving her beautifully roasted goose. Marie Suzette masked her frustration as she served her masterpiece to the undeserving guests. Apparently, the National Assembly had done it again by legally granting French citizenship to mixed-race individuals with 2 free parents. To the guests who had just murdered a man for trying to vote, the decree was not only an incredible insult, but it also carried messy legal ramifications for their actions this morning. "If the bourgeois fools in Paris think we will accept this? Governor Durand thundered, slamming his wine glass down. I'll box up Auger's head and send it back to them as a reply. That will teach them where we stand on their enlightenment. Manners, dear, his wife muttered nervously. Anna, this goose is divine. Thank you, madame. Anna beamed with pride, trying to steer the discussion back to civility. I believe you are right, dear governor, Madame de Rouvray said, in her typical haughtiness. If the National Assembly continues pushing these unsustainable laws, secession from France may become necessary. Gasps rippled through the table. Secession? Élise Duclos echoed, blinking. You can't be serious. It's a viable idea, said Hector Maubier, his tone surprisingly casual. Perhaps the Spanish— Oh, darling, you are so predictable, Anna interrupted with a tight laugh, trying to nudge him away from treason in front of the governor. Hector chuckled and carved into the goose, taking a generous bite. But Madame de Rouvray wasn't finished. What is happening in Paris will destroy us. Giving the blacks the right to vote, to be citizens, it's insanity. We paid dearly for that horrible rebellion, and our reliance on French troops cost so many more innocent lives than had we been allowed to just run everything ourselves. Around the table, a few guests nodded carefully, murmuring in agreement. Suddenly, Élise stood up. Monsieur Maubier, are you perfectly all right? All eyes turned. Hector Maubier's eyes were bulging, and his arms were moving erratically as his complexion shifted to an alarming shade of purple. Hector? Anna's voice trembled. Hector, say something! He attempted to respond, but there were no words. His hands clutched his throat. His eyes rolled back into his head. Mon Dieu, he's choking! Durand shouted, springing to his feet. Call a surgeon! Anna shrieked. Marie Cesette rushed from the room. She found the nearest overseer and told him to fetch the doctor. Then, instead of returning to the table, she stepped quietly to the hallway and watched through a narrow crack in the dining room door. Panic had swept through the gathering. Wine glasses spilled, chairs scraped the floor, and guests exchanged anxious glances, their voices rising in a cacophony of urgent pleas. The conviviality had dissipated as Anna cried for help, puncturing the frantic murmurs of the other guests. Élise dropped to her knees beside Anna, who was sobbing and trying to steady her husband's twitching frame. Élise began to pray loudly as Hector's body convulsed in his chair. Then suddenly he stopped. Anna jumped back in fear as her husband's whole frame crumpled to the floor. Then she let out a horrifying wail. Hector Maubier was dead. Marie Cesette closed her eyes and joined Élise in her prayer. And deliver us from evil. Amen. Thank you, Lord, she thought. That goose, it seemed, really was divine.